Final rule is moving forward at the Farm Credit Administration to help young, beginning, and small farmers. The rule would codify the strategic plan for credit associations and their interactions with farmers. It would also require banks to annually review and approve small farm programs. Local financial officers say any changes that simplify the farm credit services are welcome. And they say new farmers often struggle with capital when they first start.
One of the things I think a lot of people struggle with when they first start farming is just knowing their numbers. It's not a lot of things that are taught in school is, doing your input, your expenses, your break-even points.
Within the next 2 months, local credit services should get a more in-depth layout of the final rule. Any changes, the rule becomes effective on February 1st.